Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Mr. Social, aka Kevin, and we are doing the 25th episode of Let's Discuss Buddhism. This is the finale episode. It's time to move on to something else. You know, I don't have any attachment to this series. So joining me for this finale episode is my friend Chris. Now, Chris, please introduce yourself in case there are people tuning in that haven't seen you before.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Accardo. I live in Ithaca, New York. Kevin and I met through the Ithaca College Buddhist community, which we got to participate in together. I would describe myself, I'm a Vajrayana Buddhist in the Gelugpa tradition. So I attend Namgyal Monastery, which is here in Ithaca, which is why I'm in Ithaca. But I think my past, I would describe myself as a feral Buddhist, which I think most Westerners kind of are, you know, we kind of come to it on our own. So that's been my background. And yeah, so I'm happy to be here and to talk about this.
All right, perfect. So the topic for today is a really important topic. It's not something that, you know, Chris and I have talked about this before. We were just like, yeah, let's do a couple of episodes. So the topic today is why Buddhism might not be for everyone. And because I know there's a lot of interest in Buddhism and people are really interested in, you know, what if I want to practice? So this is more like a cautionary tale as to, yes, you can do this, but here are some things to just keep in mind. And these might be like difficulties or, you know, things that come in conflict with each other when it comes to a Buddhist practice. So I took the first point last time, Chris, so you can do the first point today.
Sure. And I just wanted to give you some props. This is such a cool topic, and I don't know if I've really seen it formally talked about a lot, so I just wanted to say that I'm really happy that we're doing this. This is actually a kind of a conversation we naturally had in the Ithaca College Buddhist community often. When we had beginning sit-down, learn to meditate talks, you and I would often talk with people visiting, and we'd say, well, what brought you here? And a big part of all of Buddhism is intention. Like a practice we often have when we sit down is we set our intention for the day. Why am I meditating? Why am I doing all this? And I think that's a question we should be asking when we are coming to Buddhism is, why am I doing this? I think it's very normal. And if I'm being totally honest, this is how I came to Buddhism almost 16 years ago, was with anger. I was fed up with the church. I was fed up with the religious systems that surrounded me, which I would understatedly call conservative Christian ones. And I was like, screw those guys. I'm done with those shysters and those hypocrites. And I'm going to go to Buddhism, and everything's going to be better there. And I came to Buddhism because it really resonated with me. But I did really come in with this kind of like doe-eyed, it's going to be perfect thing. And very quickly I found out that's not true. And I think that's a thing that we often talked about in the Buddhist community is, you know, people would say, well, Buddhism doesn't have this problem. And you, me, and Ron would look at each other and go, it kind of has that problem. I mean, let's talk about all the places those problems are. So I think that if we come to Buddhism if we approach it intentionally, rather than reactionarily, we can get a lot out of it. But if we're doing it as this knee-jerk reaction to systematic religion, we'll be really disappointed. And I think we might lose faith, and I think that's a problem. So I often encourage people, and to be clear, to define this, I'm looking at it as Buddhism or Dharma as texts and truth, Buddhism as the expression and practice of those texts and truth. So I think if people can spend some time with texts and with books and things like that, and then kind of bring their own baseline experience into the practice of Buddhism, they're less likely to get burned out or less likely to be overwhelmed when they face the ugly human sides of any practice. Yeah.
I think that's a very good point. My intention was almost completely different, mostly because I was just looking for an answer that I could more readily accept. So my family was not religious, so it was sort of on me to find those things, to find those answers. So I was going around the churches and everything, and I was not really finding the answers that I was looking for. I was reading texts from other religious traditions, and, you know, Buddhism sort of stuck out because it was unique, which is what we talked about in the last episode. And I studied everything that I could, and then I came to, well, I want to do Theravada because I don't like being lost in the woods. So you have a bunch of suttas or discourses to sort of guide you along the way. I mean, if you wanted to find a sutta about loneliness, you could probably find about 100 of them about loneliness and how to address loneliness.
Right.
So that's why I sort of trickled into the Theravada tradition, because it's like, well, I have a lot of source material in case I get stuck. And then I sort of integrated some of the practice things, the meditation, the contentment, the compassion, and sort of integrated that. So I think it's really good to think about, what is my intention? So I wanted to switch gears to a different point where there's sort of like a cultural clash, especially, you know, Theravada talks a lot about contentment. And in the United States, it's more of a material world, to quote Madonna. A
great teacher,
where
Madonna.
It's like, oh, well, you want to work hard, make a lot of money, make sure you have a big house, big family, a car, you know, 2 cars, a boat, or, you know, whatever it is. So it's about gaining acquisitions versus being content with what you have. And so the balancing act for that might be a lot different experience for some of us. For me, it's not such a big deal because I can say, well, I'm content with what I have, but maybe I want a little bit more. And I'm going to use these means to get that little bit more. Whereas there are others that may have difficulty with that and instead want to keep gaining. You know, I made money, now how do I make more money? And so it can be really stressful to sort of balance, you know, the practice of contentment with I want more. And so that's sort of, you know, something where I would say it's not for everyone. You got to have a temperament for that or somehow have discipline for that.
Yeah. And I think an important thing for me is that Buddhism's de-emphasis on material things is not that the material things are like bad or wicked or, you know, they're not like these dirty, terrible things. The problem is our attachment to them, which inherently gets in the way of our goal of removing attachments. An interesting thing, like in the older suttas, I've seen this now that I've started reading those some more, and I've heard venerables and monks in my own tradition talk about this. It's not that you can't achieve enlightenment while being like a normal lay person in my tradition. It's that it's really hard. It's really hard. Like, imagine trying to go to get your PhD while working full time. It's the same concept of trying to balance these things. And so I think for us, as we're navigating it, we can try and recognize that, hey, stuff in my life isn't going to help me get to enlightenment. And maybe I should work on my relationship with that. But we also don't have to like get rid of everything necessarily as lay people. But yeah, but it definitely you're absolutely right. It goes against the grain. Everything in our society as Americans is set up to be capitalist. Even our anti-capitalist kind of things and like our green movement, like we've all heard of greenwashing now, I'm sure. Like the first thing that happens is they're like, well, okay, let's make money on this. Let's sell products to declutter, you know? So yeah, I do think that as Buddhists, like that's a thing, you know, that's a struggle we're going to have is because like I do retail therapy. Look at my background versus Kevin's background. Like I do retail therapy all the time. And yeah, I think that's, we're going against the grain with our society. And anytime we do that, that's hard. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. But another thing, and you make a valid point, it's the attachment to these things that sort of gets in the way. And so then you have the age-old debate of complete abstinence, moderation, or just go with the flow. So yeah, and it's a difficult balancing act. So you get the next point, sir.
Yeah, and to just jump right off of what we were talking about, we were just saying how, in a way, we are going against the flow of our culture as we participate with this idea of kind of like getting rid of belongings. And just in general, Buddhism goes against a lot of our cultural norms here in the West. And so because of that, and this is my big point, Buddhism can be kind of lonely. I think it can be lonely kind of idealistically and conceptually, because we just have a lot of concepts and things that just don't mesh with everyone around us. I talked about this in our last one. Whenever I sit around and have interfaith dialogue, or whenever I sit around and have philosophical dialogue with people, Buddhism is that wrench that gets thrown into the works every time. It's just always complicated. It's always a little more different. And so because of that, I know I sometimes kind of walk around feeling like I don't have as many people to talk to about it. And that's the thing. The other thing is that I think it's a little lonely and that it's just not represented so much. There are big Buddhist centers and a lot of big like city capitals and big bustling cities. If you're in rural areas like we are, it's rare. I never met a lot of other Buddhists until I came to Ithaca. And I came to Ithaca because there were Buddhists here. Like it was this oasis in the Northeast, kind of. So yeah, I think that's a big thing as well, is that maybe depending on where you are, Buddhism might not be something you can just inadvertently encounter every day. You might have to kind of work on keeping your contact with it, whether it's via websites or books or chat groups or what have you. But yeah, it requires some intentionality oftentimes.
Yeah, and another aspect that might make you feel lonely is what tradition you decide you want to practice. So most centers have a certain tradition that they promote. As a, it's not like you go to a Zen Buddhist center and it represents all of Buddhism, which would be an extremely vast endeavor. So it can depend on that as well. Also, especially with Theravada, I mean, it's not very well represented here in the United States, really. And like the closest center for me would be like 30 to 40 miles away. And so it's like, okay. And then usually if they're very traditional, it's in a different language. It's not in English, because it's the his language versus his language debate, where it's like, is it the Buddha's language we're trying to promote the teaching in, or is it the language of the person that's practicing? And so I forget where I was, which city I was in. I think it was Austin, Texas. I went to like a meditation group one night, and they were talking about the other meditation centers that were around. And one asked me, do you really want to go to a service where they're speaking Thai? And I'm like, unless there's a translator, and sometimes there's not. So you sort of just like stare at them and hope you can get something from it. So that's another thing about it being sort of like a lonely pursuit, is if there's a language barrier, you're like completely lost. You have no idea what's going on. So that's another sort of aspect to that.
The language thing is huge. It's really complicated in my own monastery because it's both a culture, and a lot of these are, and there's basically within all the schools of Buddhism, then there's also the kind of like two versions of it, if you will. There's convert Buddhism, and then there's people who are bringing it as part of their tradition as immigrants to the United States. And so in my own monastery, it's very complicated because it's a cultural center and it's also a place of religious practice. And so on one hand, I can sit there and really appreciate the beauty of the cultural center and the cultural side of it. On the other hand, I chant in Tibetan. Like I go and or not with COVID, but normally 3 to 4 times a week, I am there chanting in Tibetan. And to be very clear, I do not speak Tibetan. I have I know the transliteration, and because I do it all the time, I know what it means. I can maybe point to 4 words in the text and go, I know what that word means.
Right.
And yeah, that's bewildering. That's really complicated. And I think certain places and traditions are better at translating it. But even so, there are concepts and things that are hard to translate or can't be translated. I once was talking about the Heart Sutra, which is huge in the Mahayana Vajrayana tradition. And someone was listening to me chant it, and then we were talking about it, and they said, it took me a while to realize it was in English because there were so many words that weren't, even as it was in English. Anateric samak somebody. Like we just don't have words for some of these things. And so, yeah, oftentimes I think we're translating entire concepts to ourselves. That's hard.
Right. All right. So I wanted to touch on something that's sort of applicable for the Theravada tradition. Is it can be extremely overwhelming with the number of suttas that are available for free to read. So if it's something that you're thinking about doing, it can be really overwhelming because now you got to distinguish which ones are really, I think, in most suttas, there's something that's applicable to our everyday life, but being able to pick that out can be extremely difficult and completely overwhelming. And so I think, and I have no evidence of this whatsoever. I think that's why Theravada doesn't have like a huge following in America, is because they look at the books, and the books, are like this thick, and it's like, do I really have time to look through that much text? And most of it I'm not going to be able to understand or figure out. And the nearest Theravada center is 40 miles away, and they probably don't speak English. So I thought, that's something that, should be brought to the forefront. If you are not a reader, then there are certain traditions you should avoid. If you're more of someone that, likes to, just hop into the woods and try to survive and figure it out, there are certain Buddhist traditions that are more like that. So just the vast number of suttas that are available in English, mind you, for free, can be extremely overwhelming if it's something that you're seriously looking into.
And you touched on it right there. Not even just the suttas, the number of traditions there are out there for us. So when I was introducing myself, and this is a term I often use jokingly, but really seriously, often in the West, we come to it as like feral Buddhists. Like we don't have direction. We're not coming from a tradition and going, well, this is my Buddhist tradition. We show up at Barnes and Nobles, basically, and there's this huge array of books, and then it takes you a couple years before you go, oh, Buddhism isn't monolithic. There's not one. Academically, we refer to it as Buddhisms. They're each so, they're all touching on some of the same things, and they have some similarities, but they're each so unique, so different, and have their own line of texts, just as deep as the ones Kevin are talking about. Like, I experimented with both Zen Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism, and I have entire bookshelves, and they don't even touch like a small skip. Most of them are commentaries on the same texts, and so I think when it can be bewildering coming to Buddhism in the U.S. because there are so many. And there's so many different traditions, and they each operate differently. So yeah, basically any decision you're making early on is compounded by the fact that there's just so many different versions of it. And so I often encourage people to kind of explore them all when you're first starting, like really sit with it. Like for me, off the bat, day one, Vajrayana Buddhism resonated. Like there was so much in it that resonated. And I think it's the same reason why it really took off in America is, frankly, it's kind of sexy. It's fun. It's it has a lot of bodily practice and ritual and bowing and prostrating and visualizations and things that when I can't focus and meditate and just do the sit in the woods and stare at the tree thing, that I can do other things. So I can always stay contacted with it, whether it's via, mala mantra, like chanting practice or something. So for me, that resonates. But I think it can be really bewildering trying to figure out which school you want to be a part of, or if you want to be part of one at all.
Right. And another thing about when you're doing that research is you got to sort of look at, where does Buddhism begin and where does the culture that it came from begin and end and all that jazz, because there are some forms of Buddhism where there are things like ancestral worship. Mm-hmm. And so you got to determine, is that a cultural thing or is that a Buddhism thing, or Buddhisms, if you want to use the plural. And so like describing the ancestral worship, it's just part of it's ingrained sort of in their culture. But ultimately, when it comes right to the practice, it's like, it's great that we can pray to our ancestors, but we still have to walk that path. They can try and guide us or whatever, but they're not going to save us from anything. We still have to do that ourselves. So, and I forget where I read that, but it was very interesting.
Yeah. And so I think right now what's so beautiful, but also terrifying about Buddhism in America is we're the guinea pigs. It's been here ever since people from those cultures came here, but it's awareness and it's spread and people converting to it. I mean, you're looking at post World War II kind of. In the 60s is when it takes off. So not that old. It's still forming. So we're still trying to figure out which of our cultural trappings we want to put on it. It's not in our language yet. We're still working on this so much. So it's kind of fun to be part of the grand experiment. But other times I go man, I really wish someone could just hand this to me in a neat package and go, this is what you do. Right. And to that, so I guess this is a good jumping point into my next point, maybe, authority in Buddhism, because different traditions have different emphasis on authority and authority figures, and how much, when I say authority, I mean an actual person, and how much those people have on your practice. In Vajrayana Buddhism, the teacher, as in the actual person who you go sit down and they speak with you, we chant and basically say I look at you like you're the Buddha. And that's, I'm going to be frank, that's terrifying. And as a Westerner, I am so anti-authority. We by nature, I mean, think about it, as Americans, our whole start is, no, I don't want you. It's the don't tread on me thing. And whether or not we all are to that degree of it, I think we have internalized that. I think what's different with Buddhism's authority is that it is encouraging you to ask questions about it. It's encouraging you to kind of consistently go, okay, do I really believe this? Do I really want to listen to you? Do you have all the qualities of all the things I'm looking for in a teacher? The Buddha himself said that. And every good, emphasis on good, subsequent teacher after that has done that. A thing a friend shared with me, when early on I expressed my discomfort with authority in Buddhism. And a good thing a friend shared to me is, you found the right teacher when they're working to make it so they don't have to be your teacher anymore. They want you to be on your own. They want you to practice on your own. They don't need a follower. They want to be your teacher. And sometimes Buddhism can be very formal about it. In my own tradition, we have venerables. I try not to use the word monks. We call them venerables, the venerable so-and-so. And there is a lot of formality that goes around that. I mean, you don't have to do this, but I prostrate and physically bow before my teacher, which is kind of weird as an American to do that. We don't do that a lot. And I slip out of my formality so much, and am rightly maybe chastised for it sometimes. In my own monastery, I call the venerables dude so much, and someone will be like, you just called him venerable dude.
Well, excuse me. Well, and sometimes when we're looking at a faith and everything, we sort of want to get away from that structure, but it's in Buddhism as well. And in the Theravada tradition, it's the same thing. We call them venerable. It's a very respectful title. And so I've never called a venerable dude, though. So I don't know what would happen to me if I did, because I've always been very mindful of that. Yeah, so I think for some people, that would be sort of a turnoff, because they get that every day. You know, they have a boss that's, you know, way above them, and then, you know, a supervisor that's above them, and then they're just like, you know, down here, and they sort of are looking for something more egalitarian. And it's like, well, it's just part of the structure. And, you know, it's not personal or anything. It's just sort of, you know, what you are walking yourself into. Something that you mentioned, you know, it's part of your user agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's especially in the West, though, like when people are critical of it or don't resonate with it, I totally get it, because frankly, these are the issues people were calling out with the Catholic Church forever ago. It's funny. I've sat in meditation centers and at monasteries with people who've talked about how, like, oh, you know, I left the Catholic Church. I couldn't stand how, at the time, it was all done in Latin, and, you know, they put all this emphasis on the priests and how important the priestly class was, and I hated that. Anyway, let's go chant in Tibetan. Venerable so-and-so is giving a talk, and I'm like, it's the same. It's the same problem, potentially. Right. Our intention has changed, but the artifice surrounding it is still there. And yeah, I think as Americans, like, I've brought lots of people to my monastery before, and they just go, I wasn't comfortable with that. And I go, yeah, it's not for everyone. Like, yeah. Just
like anything else. So the last point that I wanted, and these are my priority points. These are the ones that's like, I need to get these out of the way. Mm-hmm. And so another reason that Buddhism or Buddhisms may not be for everyone is you are basically your own savior in this practice. It is your efforts that lead you to nirvana. It's not the efforts of anyone else, really. They can guide you along the way, but you're the one that has to follow that path all the way to the end goal. And nirvana itself has a lot of things where it's like, there are a lot of questions. I think that is one thing, you know, you really have to look into if you are starting a Buddhist practice. Do you truly believe that your own efforts lead to your salvation? Or do you believe something differently? And maybe you should look into either another tradition in Buddhism that doesn't emphasize that as much. I think Pure Land Buddhism might be the best example of that, or maybe another religious tradition altogether. So I think really the being your own savior type thing can turn a lot of people off, because that's a big responsibility.
Yeah. And it's funny, even and you know, I gotta be honest, I always forget that Pure Land Buddhism is a thing, because that's one of the Buddhisms that throws a wrench in the Buddhism thing. Mm-hmm. But even in my own tradition, we have a lot of, I mean, you can vaguely see them over my shoulder, we have a lot of deity figures, mm-hmm. these things we pray to for inspiration and help and blah, blah, blah. And those are all like these moving, beautiful religious things I connect with. But yeah, like, shortly after you do that, it does smack you in the face again that you are the one who has to do the work. The figure is there to inspire you and to make you not afraid, but the work is still on you. They're that friend who says, no, you can do it, bud, but you still have to do it.
Right.
And I think that's really tough. I think conceptually, and people push against that.
So now we've sort of put the cautions out there, but now we're going to do a what if game sort of at the end here.
Okay.
So what if, even though we've given you all these cautions, all of these things that might get in the way, we still do want to engage in a Buddhist practice? What are some sort of tips and hints that we might have for a person that wants to still explore Buddhism and possibly start practicing Buddhism? So I already have mine written down, so I was wondering if I could go first.
Yeah, you go first, because I don't know what we're doing.
So, yeah, I sort of put it in the message, but I don't know if you look at that part of the message.
I think I missed that, but it's okay. We'll figure it out.
So I'll let you work on that, and I'll do the talking.
Yeah.
So don't get stuck on one tradition right away. It would be my first tip. Do your homework on all the traditions that you might have an interest in. So do like a Wikipedia search to get the general information on the traditions, and then do a little more digging on the traditions that most resonate with you. It's more like a gut feeling than it is a logical decision. And that's another thing, trust your instincts on that. So do your homework is sort of the first thing that I would suggest. Seek guidance where needed. You're not going to have all the answers on a website or, just contemplating it. So if there is contact information for someone who has more experience with a tradition or a practice, then reach out to them. I mean, obviously, if you're interested in the Theravada tradition, you can always comment here on YouTube, and I can get back to you on that. But seek guidance where you need it. Don't be stubborn like I am, and not ask questions. Please do. It makes things a lot easier. I've learned that the hard way. That's called experience. So when you are starting your practice, or in my situation where I've been practicing for a while, you still need to have a lot of patience with the practice because it's not going to go perfectly. And when it doesn't go perfectly, think about it and create realistic expectations. I'm not going to achieve enlightenment in my present state. I would need a lot of steps to get there. However, I can choose realistic goals and expectations where maybe it's, instead of meditating 3 times a week, I can up it to 4 times a week. Because if I try to make it every day, I probably may not reach it, and that's going to get discouraging. So making it realistic. And just like we mentioned before, be mindful of your intention. Are you doing this because you're angry at the Catholic Church? Then take time to really reflect upon that. Is that your only intention in this? Is it your only reason and purpose? Or is there some ulterior motive that you didn't see before because you're blinded by your anger? So always be mindful of that. All right, Chris, do you have any tips or suggestions for anyone who might want to look more into Buddhism or start a practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly like Kevin said, all the really big ones. So I'm just going to say other things around that. The book Buddhism for Dummies, everyone makes fun of me for having that on my bookshelf. That was like one of the first books I read. It was the best thing I ever did because it laid out some foundational things, and it said, here's how Buddhism's laid out as a religion, like with all the different traditions and things. And for me, that really cut back on my confusion time a little bit because I had some general framework to go with. So yeah, I think really looking at what you have as the scope out there. I think an important thing is to be really mindful of what sources you're looking at, though. Buddhism is very tied up in, or adopted and co-opted by, a lot of kind of vague new aginess, which I have a lot of problems with, and like I bring a lot of my own baggage when I talk about this topic. But Buddhism gets tied up in things. So I think really making sure in the beginning you're looking to some key teachers and texts and kind of things that are in our general Buddhist zeitgeist, as names like His Holiness Dalai Lama, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, Sunju Suzuki. Like there's all these names and things you can look at and go, okay, I know these are ones I can look at right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think looking at a variety of those, but limiting the scope, having a big scope of what you're willing to study in Buddhism, but kind of narrowing down who your initial contacts are, I think can be really helpful in making sure you're getting good sources and not getting so confused. And I think the big one is to be gentle with yourself when you get started, and to find the setbacks that you will encounter to be inspiring. Mingyur Rinpoche writes about this a lot, that when people start meditating and start engaging with Buddhism, they get the warm fuzzies. Like they sit and they meditate and they're calm and it's great. And they can do that for months, weeks, years, and everything goes great and they're happy. And then all of a sudden, it gets loud in your brain and it's not so easy to meditate anymore. And in our own tradition, that's the moment where it goes, okay, you're now actually seeing what's in your brain. So you thought you were doing the work and you did a prerequisite, but now you're actually doing the work and it gets tough again. And I think Buddhism is this cycle of that. It's you get into a practice and it's going great. And then it's like, oh, it's not going so great anymore. And it's like, okay, yeah, go back into that practice. Keep doing it. Sharon Salzberg, the teacher, says that Buddhism and meditation is about the return. It's not about whether the practice is working. It's whether when it's not, you can gently steer it back on course and get it working again. And I think that's huge. I think the first time, if you choose to practice, that you start practicing, the first time that happens, you can really feel a deep sense of despair and questioning and confusion. And all of that is good that you're having those questions and ask those questions and engage with those questions. But it's okay. It's okay if it doesn't work right away. It's not going to. Just go back to it. You know?
Right. And, something you and I as practitioners have talked about is, being hard on ourselves because we have the tools, but we don't use the tools during the appropriate times. Of course, hindsight's 20/20. We know the appropriate time when it's all done and over with.
We talk about this a lot in my own tradition. There's having the understanding the idea of the thing and then experiencing the thing. And I think that absolutely applies well to all the bad things in our life. There's our idea of what we need to do when we have a problem, when we experience death, or when we experience this or that. And then there's what actually happens when we really experience it. Every practitioner should know is that, and maybe you'll disagree with this, I don't know. I've heard teachers say Buddhism isn't about helping you grow up. It's about getting you to enlightenment. It's helping you to waken up. But there are things we have to work on ourselves outside of Buddhism still. Like, it doesn't fix everything. And so I really encourage people that even as you're practicing Buddhism, don't think of it as this panacea to fix every problem in your life. There are other resources we have that we should be using and that we can bring our Buddhism to, and we can use those resources. We can use medicine and therapy and psychology, and we can use all those things. That's the cool thing about Buddhism, is that it doesn't reject those things. Buddhism loves neuroscience and psychology. So I think we should really engage with those things and really use those things and just not view Buddhism as the huge fix for every problem in our life as we're practicing it.
There's nothing in the text that says you can't go see a psychologist or anything like that. And if it did, I'd be like, nope, this is definitely not the faith for me.
Yeah.
I want to have all those options available. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that Buddhism is not something where it's like it has all the tools to fix everything. Sometimes the right tools just aren't there for that particular person, for that particular situation. So you can still practice mindfulness and say, look, I need an alternative solution to this issue that has come up. And then the heedfulness part is taking that information and actually doing what needs to be done about that.
Necessarily. It's the solution to those big problems, which Kevin brought up at the beginning of our talk last time, and I'm sure every other talk. It's that big solution to why am I suffering? What am I doing? It's that answer, but there's still other things in life, and I think it's good that Buddhism gives us that space to find those other answers.
I think we've covered all the points that we need to, and now it's up to everyone else to choose their path. So thanks again for joining me, Chris. This was a great discussion on a very important topic, and like I said, maybe I'll be doing like some Dharma talks or something on my channel in the future. I would love to collaborate with you on those maybe in the future as well.
Yeah, and I just want to really thank you for inviting me to be here. I want to thank you for doing this and having these talks with people. I think that's really cool that you're doing that. And I wish everyone who's listening well as they're navigating their practice. And yeah, if you ever want me back, I would love to talk more with you. So,
All right, so that's our cue.
yeah.
Take care, everyone, and we'll be talking to you later. Who knows? All right, take care. Take care, Chris.